should consider yourself lucky. At least your balls won't freeze off.
You take great offense at dwarf jokes, but love telling eunuch jokes. Why is that?
Because I have balls. You don't.
Hello everybody, welcome to my video on eunuchs. So what is a eunuch? A eunuch is an individual without a cock or without balls, or both. It really depends on the culture and the procedure in general, but that's basically a eunuch. And so in this video I want to explain what a eunuch is, the origins, and kind of its spread. For now though, what is the origins of making someone into a eunuch? First, it would start an animal. Very ancient tradition of just castrating animals. But regardless, one method of castrating animals, and a safe method, would be to, and this is for newborn males, the major mortality issue that comes with turning someone into a eunuch and castrating them, the age, right? So if it's an adult male, they have less chances of surviving than a younger person. So in this case, animals, it would be a newborn male, and they would usually use a string or horsehair and tie it around the scrotum. It causes the testicles to turn black, and they drop in about 3 weeks. So very simple. Sometimes people would take a young animal, maybe something like a lamb, and they would put the testicles in their mouth and just bite it right off. The testicles could be crushed, they could be shattered, struck, edged out, cut out.
Oh, girls weren't lying. You had a good sized cock.
Human castration and turning people into eunuchs would be a practice that would originate from punishing people. That would be if someone committed a sexual crime, they could be punished with eunuchification, either through cutting off the testicles or removing the penis. When this did happen, sometimes these individuals would become courtiers or servants.
Do eunuchs have a phantom cock? Next time you think about naked girls, when you feel an itch.
And really, eunuchs are a very deeply rooted institution occurring in a lot of the Mediterranean and Asian empires. Really, Western Europe and pre-colonial America would be where you see a complete lack of eunuchs. Eunuchs would first start appearing in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, then all the Persian empires like the Achaemenids, the Parthians, the Sassanids, and then afterwards the Romans and the Byzantines would also employ them. All the Chinese empires as well, starting with the Zhao in 1045 BCE and to the Qing actually in 1911.
Tell me, does someone somewhere keep your balls in a little box?
And even though eunuchs were excluded from servant duty and government work or military positions, they were still employed in Western Europe as a type of singer actually. They would be called the castrati actually, and they'd be castrated church singers for the Byzantine Empire and also perform church choirs in the mid-16th century, and also become widely popular in opera stages because of how their voices had changed due to the whole procedure of becoming a eunuch. And alongside these civilizations would also include every single Islamic empire. Now, every single Islamic empire would have eunuchs employed, from the Abbasids and the Umayyads actually, all the way to the Ottomans, Mughals, Safavids, and everybody else would use eunuchs in their administration, as well as in their military.
Leave now, or suffer my fate. Have you ever sampled the third six Latin?
So the $1,000,000 question is, why even use eunuchs in the first place? Eunuchs are very advantageous in a lot of ways. First and foremost, they're very loyal. Their loyalty stretches from the fact that all their power rests in the hands of the monarch. So whether they're serving a king, a sultan, an emperor, they are usually only getting that power from the monarch. They don't have any ties to their families most of the time, which means that they can't really have a power base to depend on. There'd be certain societies like the Byzantines, for example, where eunuchs would still have ties to their families, and that's because the Byzantines, they recruited from their own populations. Same with also the Chinese. Some empires like the Islamic empires from the Abbasids all the way to the Ottomans, they would use non-Muslim locations to gather up eunuchs from. They would go to Africa, particularly in Darfur or Sudan, and engage in the slave trade there, or in Christian communities in Egypt, for the Ottomans case, the Balkans, or in Circassia for the Safavids Safavids and the Ottomans, Central Asia as well. And by recruiting a eunuch from the outside and planting him into a foreign culture, that forced them to be extremely loyal to the monarch. And because of this loyalty, that meant that the eunuchs would usually not rebel, whether he be in an administrative, military, or even very small servitude position of just being a cupbearer. Now, a second important reason why eunuchs were used is because a lot of these societies that had eunuchs also secluded off the royal women. So that would include wives of the ruler, that would include the moms of the ruler, that would include the concubines, and that would also include the children of the rulers as well. And so this seclusion was used to limit the children, particularly the sons of each of the wives and the concubines, and to ensure they never have sexual relations with anyone else besides the ruler. Now, in Islamic societies, this was called a harem, but this type of inner sanctum with all the women, this harem complex, was not just used in Islamic empires and kingdoms, but also in Imperial China, in Roman, Byzantine, and ancient Persian empires. And even if the ruler of the empire, let's say the Ottoman Empire, were to marry a different kingdom or a different empire, then that foreign queen would still live in the harem after the wedding, sharing the quarters with the concubines. And so, because eunuchs were castrated, they were seen as ideal to police the boundary between the harem and the rest of the world. Now, the third reason would be that these regimes would employ elite military administrative slaves. In the Islamic empires, these were called either Mamelukes or Gulams, depending on the culture at hand. These young male recruits from lands outside the empire were usually ignorant of the language or customs of that empire. They were in the barracks or similar areas or complexes for training with older recruits who could abuse them, who could take advantage of them sexually. And the ruler had eunuchs in these areas to protect the new recruits from being taken advantage by the older recruits, the same way as how they protected the women's quarters by policing the sexuality of these inhabitants. Now, while the process of becoming eunuch was without the consent of the person becoming the eunuch most of the time, the larger the eunuch numbers, the greater the need for eunuchs actually became, because eunuchs would also have servants that were also eunuchs. And in certain societies, eunuchs can also adopt younger eunuchs as eunuch families and pass down their eunuch inheritance between their sons. And due to this fact that they usually were living with the Sultan or with the monarch in question, whether it be from China to Anatolia, they usually lived a very lavish lifestyle. They had clothing, they were always fed, they had the best medical care, usually had education. I mean, they were running administrative and military posts. Now, eunuchs would have a pretty high death rate. It was the cutting off of the testicles and the penis. But if the testicles were the only things that were removed, then that would give the eunuchs more of a chance of survival. This is also due to the fact that after when the penis is cut off, there's a bunch of urinary problems that could be created later down the line in the eunuch's life. In fact, the whole side effects of what happens to a eunuch are very interesting. They either become very lanky and they have very brittle, very weak bones, or they become very fat. They also excessively wrinkle. The cost of doing it is also negligible as well. Beardlessness is another big thing of a eunuch. They have very weakened muscular structure and fat similar to women actually. It is very common for eunuchs to develop breasts, basically. In the Islamic empires, they would practice radical castration, which is they would cut off the testicles and the penis. Ancient China would also do the same thing, as well as in dynasties as well. One unique attribute of the Islamic empires is that because they had a large diversity of different eunuchs to choose from different slave sources, so in some empires there would be a African eunuch or a black eunuch and then a white eunuch. This is very apparent in the Ottoman Empire, where they had a black eunuch and a white eunuch and chiefs for those eunuchs. The Ottoman Empire would actually have the eunuchs divvied up by their jobs in terms of their race and also their castrational practices. So, for example, black eunuchs would usually have their penises cut off, whereas white eunuchs would not. And their high death rate also associated with an added profit to it. In different areas where the eunuchs would have less of a chance of survival, the eunuchs from that location would become more expensive, Now, there are multiple different procedures for how to create a eunuch, and there's a lot of differences in the cultures themselves. Really, the bottom line is that either the penis or the testicles are castrated. Most of the time in societies outside of the Islamic empires, it would be a castration of just the testicles. One major side effect of the eunuch procedure is that if they cut off the penis, which does tend to happen, the issues that occur that the eunuch will sometimes squirt out urine just without any control whatsoever. And so because of this, they would always smell like piss. And this kind of leads to a Chinese folk saying as stinky as a eunuch. And this would happen in Imperial China and in most Muslim empires, where radical castration was the norm.
He gave me a potion that made me powerless to move or speak, yet did nothing to dull my senses. With a hooked blade, he sliced me, root and stem, chanting all the while. He burned my parts in a brazier. The flames turned blue, and I heard a voice answer his call.
So now that we're done talking about at least the context, let's talk about some procedures, the fun stuff. Now, when castration was done as a form of punishment, it would be really brutal actually in comparison to the later methods we'll see. One method would be to use the sword to slice off the penis and the testicles. And in this way, the mortality rate was obviously extremely high, but this was pretty much a symbolic way to kill the enemy. And these guys weren't really ever offered any higher positions besides that of courtiers or servants. However, as in the case for a lot of different societies, most notably Islamic societies, as well as Chinese societies, there would be a desire for eunuchs to have both the testicles and penis cut off. And this was done by, well, the method you'll see right here. And the mortality rate of a simple castration is so much lower than cutting off the penis, which is major, and can cause uncontrollable bleeding and a greater chance of infection in lifelong urinary problems. Specifically, urinary tract infection becomes a common problem. In most cases, total castration, the individual is buried in sand up to the waist for several days to stop the bleeding. Fluids and foods were not given during that time frame. There is a different eunuch method that the Byzantines use a lot, in which they are castrated by crushing the testicles, by basically putting them in water, slowly with hot water, squeezing the testes until they dissolve. Now, there is also the case of individuals being willingly castrated, as families saw advantages for this individual as well as for themselves to have someone who was castrated and become a eunuch. Besides palace advisors, eunuchs can also be generals, admirals, especially in the Byzantine Empire. They could also become patriarchs of the church, and they can become special envoys for the ruler themselves. Here's the thing too, is that this wouldn't be something ubiquitous, as in every society has the same rules for a eunuch position. Say for instance, in Islamic societies, eunuchs would not be able to have a religious position. In some societies, the usage of eunuchs was a way to undercut already established groups, such as when in China they used eunuchs to basically undercut the power of the Confucian-trained civil service and the advisors and the bureaucracy within that group. And so because of that, there was a rivalry between the eunuchs and these civil servicemen. Also in the Safavid Empire, where the Safavid Shah would use eunuchs to undercut the power of the tribal groups that were having enormous influence over the Safavid Empire. In fact, the Safavid Shah would begin moving his children from these provincial governors to moving them into the harem itself. This was a way of ensuring that these tribal forces did not have any power over the future kings, which could result in a civil war where these tribal groups are trying to jockey for power. Instead, now the eunuchs are able to undercut the tribal groups by being able to grab governmental positions, taking over certain tribal lands, basically replacing the government officials that were tribal with eunuchs instead, creating an equal balance that was always ebbing and flowing with power. It's important to note that some institutions of eunuchs were just developed because they inherited the previous owner's institutions. So for example, when the Achaemenid rulers of Persia conquered the Assyrians, they basically adopted the Assyrian usage of eunuchs. One interesting thing about the harems as well is that while the eunuchs were able to gain enormous amount of power by being right next to the rulers, they also were able to gain power by being next to the families of the rulers. So for example, particularly the women of the rulers. And this would be in terms of his mom having considerable influence, his aunts, his sisters, his wives, And it was really because of the eunuch's ability to enter this private harem world and operate in the outer courts as well. So he can aid the king and also aid the royal women inside the court. And this is true for not only the various Persian empires and Iranian empires, but basically all aspects of eunuchs, in which women are segregated from the rest of the population, like a separate inner court and outer court. So if the civilization didn't have those concepts, you likely wouldn't see those examples go about. But regardless, eunuchs were very much the servants of the women of the ruler. And we hear of some powerful women and some powerful eunuchs, and the eunuchs were very well cared for by the ladies in the court. They were given any accommodation, and the housing accommodations must have been really nice for them. Now, going back to sexual availability of eunuchs, one interesting example would be the eunuch Bagos, who was a sexual partner of Alexander the Great, as well as being the sexual partner of Darius III. So he slept with Darius III and Alexander the Great. This guy, he's going places, let me tell you. Now, the ultimate question would be, how many eunuchs could these civilizations have? And well, we have a Persian example in which a 4th century Greek source has stated that they could have 360 concubines. So it was not only because the Shah's wife had eunuchs and his mom, but also the concubines, his sisters, all of the sex slaves that he could possibly have. And the king usually had multiple wives, one for each day of the year, which is pretty fucking funny. Darius III is said to have lost 329 when he fled from Alexander the Great in Syria. But let's take a later example. Even the Safavid rulers from about 1501 to about 1736, for example, would have 12,000 concubines. All of these women were housed near the king, and the Safavids definitely practiced an inner court and outer court sort of culture and lifestyle. Eunuchs would sometimes live in the palace, or they would live in separate eunuch apartments. This is something that we see in Imperial Chinese palaces and Ottoman palaces, but we also see it in these Persian Achaemenidian palaces. However, later on, eunuchs would become less and less of a thing in these empires. And a large chunk of that reason would be due to, in some ways, colonization and colonialism and imperialism. So basically, due to the fact that later European powers will abolish slavery, this made it harder for the Ottomans, especially when they lost African territories, to obtain slaves and to obtain eunuchs. Fortunately for the Ottomans, they would have to gain eunuchs through just gifts by different people. The Chinese would continue to use eunuchs until Qing, in which case then the imperial dynasty of China completely phases out. Alright. And that pretty much ends my video on eunuchs. It was way longer, actually, my first draft of this video, than the final product, and that's mostly because I just had a lot to say. But then I realized that I could probably condense these informations down into their own videos rather than just overloading you guys in one video. So having a comprehensive sort of summary and a very, very brief look at just the eunuchs as an institution is really just all what I was going for. And in terms of specifics, we will get into all these different eunuch characters and people that were very, very instrumental in their respective civilizations, while also specific civilizations and their practices with eunuchs, like the Chinese or the Islamic empires. But without further ado, we are done. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed it, like the video and let me know. Bye-bye.